All right, we're joined now on set by a guy who runs about $130 billion. Scott Minerd is managing partner and chief investment strategist with Guggenheim Partners. If you watched our coverage last night, Dagan and I were here working late for you guys. If you watched our coverage, you know Scott was on. We talked about the massive debt burden that we and really the world is likely to face right now. The question now becomes, since we've had a night to sleep on it, actually I didn't sleep on it because I was so scared by what you said that I couldn't sleep.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean, come on. Where do we go? Okay, we know the government's issuing money, right? So money is increasing, maybe inflation. Well, you know what? Do we even care about inflation now?
We don't care about inflation right now. That's going to be something we care about in another 3 to 5 years. That's when we're going to start worrying about inflation.
But you are less worried. You are actually see some, optimism in the next few days.
Well, yeah, and I tell you, I heard a statistic this morning which was really interesting. Lawrence Lindsay actually stated it. If we get the S&P down to the neighborhood of 800, which I think is technically a bottom, that neighborhood, the total market cap of equities in the United States will be approximately equal in proportion to GDP to what they were at the bottom of the market in 1932. So we are approaching a market valuation level at this stage that's equal to the lowest market valuation in the worst financial crisis in U.S. history. This is probably, I believe by Tuesday we will have put a bottom in. So I am a buyer of equities at this point. I think that's the first time you've ever heard me say that, too.
Yeah, it is.
I think this is a great buying opportunity. And
everywhere, buy the market?
I think, buy the market. I mean, if you have some expertise in certain areas, I would recommend that you could maybe do closed-end mutual funds if you're an individual. They're really cheap.
Because those have just, that is a sign of the panic and the volatility out there because the discount that the prices have gotten to, right?
That's right.
The underlying net asset value, like 20 or 30% on some of these funds.
That's right. On high-quality funds, I mean, there's stuff out there managed by PIMCO, a competitor of ours.
You've got one, too. I know you're not allowed to talk about it. That's the way. Closed-end funds, folks, for people who don't know, they've got sort of set baskets. They've got a set net asset value. Guys who issue them like Scott aren't allowed to talk about them just due to marketing regulations, but we can talk about them. And your fund, below net asset value, it's got a dividend, and that's all I'll say.
Right. Yeah, well, the dividend, I can say this. The dividend yield on the close last night was around 20%.
There you go. GOF is the ticker on Scott's thing. He cannot talk about it, but I can bring it up just the facts. Not saying to do anything with it, just letting you know that it exists.
Does your optimism seems to just be factored in the pure pessimism that's being factored into stocks right now, not what the government is doing? Do you think the government should just butt out? And have we lost all confidence in leaders far and wide here?
Well, let me say one thing about the government. I am so fed up with hearing people in Washington blaming this on the free markets. This disaster that we are in is completely the product of screwed up policies in Washington for the last 20 years.
Why?
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should have never existed in the size that they were at. They had unfair advantage in pricing their debt. They could borrow better than anybody else could borrow because of this implied government guarantee, which we found out is a government guarantee. And because of that, any mortgage they offered was cheaper than any mortgage anybody else would offer. So the only way to compete with these people, if you were a bank, was to give looser terms, be more aggressive on lending standards. And, it's a classic example.
But the private sector created those trillions of dollars of complex debt securities that we now are only beginning to unravel.
That's right. And I think that...
And then the government allowed Fannie and Freddie to take it to new levels that it was probably never intended for.
Well, Fannie and Freddie began, in order to compete with the private sector, began to put money into those things. So, I mean, this whole bubble was a result of a distortion in bad public policy out of Washington. And to be honest with you, I think the whole Congress should be turned out and we should start over.
If they keep talking, though, do they fan the flames of fear here?
Well, they certainly are. I mean, they've been bungling this thing now for months. And where we're at now, as I mentioned yesterday, is we're down to the last 3 policy options. Guarantee all the deposits of the banking system.
Talked about, right?
Which they're talking about. G7 IMF global bailout. Or the Federal Reserve just stepping in and saying, no matter how many Treasury securities you issue, we stand ready to buy them, which in the long run will destroy the American dollar and be hyperinflationary in 20 years.
Yeah, and then we get Zimbabwe or Germany 1918, and we
Right.
get those types of situations where there's way too much money and you just start wallpapering your home with $20 bills.
Well, and what you said about Germany and the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, that is the most frightening scenario, because the first step down that road is you start looking for scapegoats.
Yeah.
And boy, that's what I'm hearing. The fat cats in Wall Street are
Well,
created
Jim Rogers said it, though, bailing out the 29-year-old Maserati drivers. But anyway.
Of course, he used to be a fat cat in Wall Street.
Yes, indeed.
Now he's a fat cat in Singapore.
Plenty of blame to go around. How's that?
Yeah, well, if Congress
Scott.
would stop doing this and start solving problems, or maybe just get out of the business.
Problem solver,
Right.
Scott.
Fire everybody, start over.
Dagan,
Scott
thank
Miner,
you.
thanks very much.
Well, speaking of